They promised each other forever, but forever ended with unanswered calls, late-night silences, and the warmth of a stranger's touch. This is the story of a marriage torn apart, not in one explosive moment, but through a slow, steady drift into betrayal. A wife chasing a new life miles away, a husband left behind to care for their child, and a choice that will change them all forever. You're watching Betrayal Diaries, where real stories of love, lies, and heartbreak are told without filters. If you crave raw, emotional tales that dig into the darkest corners of relationships, subscribe now and turn on the bell icon, because you won't want to miss what comes next. It was an overcast morning in late February, the kind of Texas morning where the wind smells faintly of dust and rain. Mark sat on the porch steps of their small suburban home, rubbing his rough hands together, listening to the distant hum of the highway. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. Rachel stepped out wearing a faded cardigan, her brown hair pulled into a low bun. She placed a mug next to him, but her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond their front yard. "You remember Lisa from church?" she began. "Her cousin in Seattle says there's an opening at a logistics company. Good pay, benefits. I could apply." Mark blinked, the steam from his coffee blurring his view of her face. "Seattle's 2,000 miles away, Rach." "I know, but it's a chance. For us. For Sophie." They'd been scraping by for years. Between the mortgage, the old Ford truck that needed constant repairs, and the medical bills from Sophie's asthma, their savings account had never stayed above a few $100s. That evening, Lisa stopped by. She painted a picture of opportunity, downtown skyline views, better schools, enough money to replace their leaky roof. Rachel listened with the kind of half-smile Mark hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't the smile of hope exactly, more like anticipation. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Rachel sat in the dim living room, scrolling through job listings on her phone. "If I stay here, we'll never get ahead." Mark didn't answer right away. He thought about the way their life had become, measured in overdue bills and weather reports. He also thought about what it meant for a wife to be gone that far, that long. 2 weeks later, Rachel booked a Greyhound ticket to Seattle. Seattle's winter rain was nothing like the quick showers back in Texas. Here it was a steady curtain, draping the streets in a dull silver light. Rachel pulled her coat tighter as she hurried from the bus stop toward the glass front building where she now worked, a logistics company that handled everything from medical supplies to imported coffee beans. It was her second week. She still got lost in the maze of hallways, still fumbled with the complicated coffee machine in the break room. That morning, as she wrestled with a jammed drawer at her desk, a deep voice spoke behind her. "Careful with that thing, it's taken out better people than you." She turned to see a man in his late 30s, tall, with sandy brown hair and the kind of relaxed smile that made you feel like you'd known him longer than a few seconds. His navy blazer looked expensive but worn in, like it belonged to someone who didn't need to prove anything. "Daniel Carter," he said, offering a hand. "Floor supervisor. You must be Rachel from Texas, right?" "Yeah," she replied, shaking his hand. "Guess my accent gave me away." "A little," he said with a grin. "Welcome to the rain capital. You'll learn to love the coffee, or at least depend on it." They shared a small laugh. It felt easy, too easy. In the weeks that followed, Daniel would stop by her workstation now and then, sometimes to check on a shipment report, sometimes just to comment on the weather
or tell her where to find the best clam chowder in the city. One Wednesday afternoon, the sky outside was already dim, though it was only 4 o'clock. Rachel sat staring at a spreadsheet when Daniel appeared at her side, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," he said, sliding one toward her. "I didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." The coffee was hot, rich, far better than the bitter stuff from the break room. She took a sip, and for a brief moment, the rain outside felt softer. That evening, as she walked back to her rented room, Rachel realized she had told Daniel more about her day than she had told Mark in weeks. There was no flirtation, at least not yet, but in the quiet space between them, something unspoken had started to breathe. And while she didn't know it then, that small warmth on a cold Seattle day would grow into the fire that would burn away what was left of home.
Back in Cedar Falls, Texas, the wind had a bite to it. Mark sat at the kitchen table with the old cordless phone pressed to his ear, listening to the flat ringtone. When Rachel finally picked up, the background noise was loud. Voices, clinking glasses, music muffled like it was coming from a nearby bar. "Hey," she said quickly. "Hey, where are you?" "Just out with a couple coworkers, networking, you know?" Mark stared at the half-empty plate of reheated lasagna in front of him. "How's work?" "Busy. I can't talk long, okay? I'll call you tomorrow." Before he could say anything else, the line went quiet. He set the phone down slowly, the silence of the kitchen swelling in its place. Sophie sat on the couch with her homework, glancing over at him. "Was that Mom?" "Yeah," Mark said. "She's busy." He forced a smile, but Sophie didn't return it. She'd stopped asking when her mom would come home. In Seattle, Rachel stepped out into the misty air after leaving the pub. Daniel was there, leaning against the side of his silver sedan. "You didn't tell me you'd be here," she said, surprised. "Lisa mentioned you guys were out. I figured I'd save you the bus ride in this weather." It wasn't pouring, but the drizzle was constant, clinging to her hair and coat. She hesitated for a second, then got into the passenger seat, the smell faintly of leather and cedar. On the short drive to her apartment, Daniel asked about her family. She told him about Sophie's asthma, about Mark's double shifts at the local hardware store, and about the house they'd been struggling to keep. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady on the road. "Sounds like you've been carrying a lot," he said quietly. "I guess." When they pulled up in front of her building, he turned to her. "Rachel, you deserve to breathe once in a while." The words landed heavier than she expected. She mumbled a thank you and stepped out, the rain tapping against the hood of her coat. As she climbed the stairs, she realized she'd never heard Mark say anything quite like that. That night, she lay in bed scrolling through her phone. Mark had texted earlier, "Hope you got home safe. Call me if you can." She didn't reply. Instead, she opened the weather app and stared at the forecast, 5 more days of rain. And somewhere in the rhythm of those drops, Daniel's voice kept repeating in her head, "You deserve to breathe." In Cedar Falls, the rain had been pounding for 2 days straight. Mark woke up shivering, his head heavy and throat raw. He tried to get out of bed, but the room tilted. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her oversized hoodie dragging along the floor. "Dad, you look sick," she said, frowning. "Just a little cold, kiddo. I'm fine." She didn't buy it. By noon, he was sweating through his t-shirt, coughing into the crook of his arm. Sophie made him a can of chicken noodle soup, the kind Rachel used to buy in bulk, and brought it to his bedside. "You should call Mom," she suggested. "Yeah, maybe later," Mark replied, though he knew he would call right away. When he did, the call went to voicemail. He tried again and again. Finally, he sent a text. "I'm sick. Sophie's worried. Call me when you can." 3 time zones away, Rachel's phone buzzed in her purse as she sat in a corner booth of a dimly lit wine bar. Across from her, Daniel leaned back, his eyes warm, the collar of his shirt open just enough to suggest comfort rather than formality. "You've been in Seattle for a few months now. Do you feel like it's home yet?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Some days, yeah. Other days I miss things, but not as much as I thought I would." Daniel studied her for a moment. "I think you're stronger here. Lighter, even." Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, Mark's name. Another missed call. She flipped it face down on the table. They talked until the bar's chatter faded into the background hum of jazz. When they stepped outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Daniel walked her to her building, stopping under the awning. "Can I come up?" he asked, voice low. Rachel hesitated. She could feel the weight of the unanswered calls in her pocket like a stone she wasn't ready to pick up. She nodded. Upstairs, the apartment was warm. The city's lights spilled across the floor through half-closed blinds. She made coffee, though neither of them touched it. When Daniel kissed her, it was slow and deliberate, as if sealing something unspoken that had been building for weeks. In Texas, Mark fell asleep to the sound of rain hitting the old roof, Sophie's small frame curled up in a chair beside his bed. His phone lay on the nightstand, the screen dark. The text he'd sent hours ago still had no reply.
Mark's fever broke 2 days later, but the fatigue clung to him. He was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, when Sophie slid her homework across the table. "Can you help me with this?" she asked. He tried, but his mind kept drifting to the unanswered messages. Rachel had finally called late the night before, her voice rushed, blaming a work dinner and bad reception. She hadn't asked about his fever until the end of the call, almost as an afterthought. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them to Sophie's hopeful face. "Yeah, kiddo, let's figure it out together." In Seattle, Rachel awoke to the smell of fresh coffee, not from her machine, but from Daniel's. He was standing in her small kitchen, sleeves rolled up, moving with the ease of someone who belonged there. "Morning," he said with a smile. "You cook now?" she teased. "Only when I'm motivated." He set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. She realized she hadn't had someone make her breakfast in years. They ate together, knees brushing under the table, the kind of quiet intimacy that felt dangerous precisely because it was so ordinary. After breakfast, he leaned back in his chair. "Rach, you know we're past the point of just friends, right?" She looked down at her coffee, then up at him. The warmth in his eyes wasn't the same as Mark's steady loyalty. It was lighter, freer, and it pulled her in. "Yeah," she said softly. That was the moment. No excuses, no plausible deniability. In Seattle, after hanging up, Rachel turned back to Daniel, who was leaning against her kitchen counter, 2 glasses of wine already poured. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, taking the glass from him. "Everything's fine." But as she took the first sip, a small voice deep inside whispered the truth. Nothing about this was fine, and she wasn't sure she cared anymore. It was a Saturday afternoon in Cedar Falls when Mark's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Tyler, who now worked in Portland. "Hey, isn't your wife in Seattle? Thought you should see this." Attached was a photo. It wasn't staged, but it didn't need to be. Her hand hooked into the crook of his arm. They weren't looking at the camera, just at each other, smiling in a way Mark hadn't seen from her in years. The man was tall, with sandy hair and a confident posture. Even in the grainy photo, there was an ease between them that spoke louder than any caption. Mark stared at the screen, a dull ringing in his ears. He read the message again and again, hoping some detail would change, that maybe he was mistaken. But the coat Rachel wore, he'd bought it for her last winter online, spending a little extra because she'd said Seattle winters were colder than they looked. He set the phone down, pressing both hands against his face. In the living room, Sophie was coloring on the floor, humming to herself. She didn't notice her father sit completely still for almost 5 minutes. That evening, Mark called Rachel. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, isn't your wife in Seattle? Thought you should see this." Attached was a photo. It wasn't staged, but it didn't need to be. The shot caught Rachel on a quiet downtown street in the soft light of late evening. She was standing close to a man Mark had never met, her hand hooked into the crook of his arm. They weren't looking at the camera, just at each other, smiling in a way Mark hadn't seen from her in years. The man was tall, with sandy hair and a confident posture. Even in the grainy photo, there was an ease between them that spoke louder than any caption. Mark stared at the screen, a dull ringing in his ears. He read the message again and again, hoping some detail would change, that maybe he was mistaken. But the coat Rachel wore, he'd bought it for her last winter online, spending a little extra because she'd said Seattle winters were colder than they looked. He set the phone down, pressing both hands against his face. In the living room, Sophie was coloring on the floor, humming to herself. She didn't notice her father sit completely still for almost 5 minutes. That evening, Mark called Rachel. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, where are you?" "At my place. Why?" "Who's Daniel?" A pause. Then, "He's my supervisor." "Why are you asking?" "Because I saw a picture. You were with him. Looked close." Her tone hardened. "Mark, you can't just jump to conclusions because of a photo." "Then tell me I'm wrong." Silence. "Rach? I don't want to do this right now. I'll call you later." The line went dead. In Seattle, Rachel set her phone down on the coffee table. Daniel was sitting beside her, wine glass in hand. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, just Mark being Mark." Daniel didn't press. He leaned in, kissed her temple, and for the rest of the night, they didn't talk about Texas. Back in Cedar Falls, Mark poured himself a drink he didn't really want. The photo was still open on his phone, the screen casting a pale light across the room. The image felt heavier than any proof of words, because you can argue with a story, but not with a moment that's been caught and frozen in time.
A cold front swept through Cedar Falls that week, dropping the temperature to the low 30s. Mark had been feeling run down for days, but that night, the fever hit hard. His skin burned, and every breath felt like it scraped his chest raw. Sophie stood by his bed, clutching a bottle of orange juice. "Dad, you need to go to the doctor." "It's just the flu, kiddo. I'll be fine." But he wasn't fine. By midnight, the coughing fits left him dizzy. He reached for his phone, scrolling to Rachel's number. The call rang until voicemail picked up. He tried again and again. Finally, he sent a text. "I'm sick. Sophie's scared. Please call." 3 time zones away in Seattle, Rachel's phone lay face down on the nightstand. The faint vibration of incoming calls barely registered over the low hum of music in the apartment.
She was curled against Daniel on the couch, his arm draped around her, as they shared a bottle of Merlot. "You're quieter tonight," he murmured. "Just tired," she said, taking another sip of wine. Daniel tilted her chin and kissed her, slow and deliberate. Within minutes, the half-full glasses were forgotten, and they moved to the bedroom. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, steady and soft. Inside, the world beyond those walls ceased to exist. In Texas, Sophie sat curled up in the recliner, still wearing her jacket from school, watching her father struggle to breathe evenly. The old heater rattled in the corner, doing little to push back the cold seeping into the room. She kept glancing at the silent phone on the nightstand. "Dad, maybe I should call Aunt Claire," she said in a small voice. "No, don't worry your aunt. Your mom will call." But even he didn't believe it. He closed his eyes, imagining her voice, her hand on his forehead, like she used to when they were younger, before Seattle, before Daniel. But the only thing in the room was the faint hiss of the heater and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Near midnight Pacific time, Rachel and Daniel lay tangled in the sheets, the city's glow painting faint stripes of light across their skin. Her phone lit up one last time, the screen showing Mark, 3 missed calls. She turned it over without looking and pressed closer to Daniel. The ocean of miles between Texas and Washington had never felt wider. And somewhere in that distance, the final thread that had tethered her to home quietly, irrevocably snapped. It was a crisp Friday morning in late March when Mark's phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. "Hey, it's me," Rachel's voice came through, flat and quick. "Rachel? Yeah, I'm at the Greyhound station. I'm in town for a few days. Paperwork stuff. Can you pick me up?" Mark's first instinct was to ask, "Why now?" But instead he just said, "Yeah, stay there." The drive to the station felt longer than it should. When he spotted her, she was standing beneath a metal awning, a sleek black suitcase by her side. Her hair was shorter now, cut in a way that framed her face sharply. She looked different, not just in style, but in the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, gaze level, as if the small Texas town no longer fit her. "Hi," she said when he stopped in front of her. "Hi," he replied. They didn't hug. On the ride home, Sophie peppered her with questions about school in Seattle, about the food, about the weather. Rachel answered lightly, smiling for her daughter, but her eyes never lingered on Mark. It was as if the passenger seat were a border she wouldn't cross. At the house, Rachel walked through the front door and looked around like a visitor taking inventory. The same old couch, the same faded rug, even the faint mustiness in the air was familiar. "You didn't change much," she remarked. "Didn't have a reason to," Mark said, his voice even. Over lunch, the silence between their sentences was louder than the clink of silverware. Finally, Mark asked, "You still seeing him?" Rachel set down her fork. "Mark, I didn't come back to rehash this. So that's a yes." She met his eyes, unflinching. "I came to take care of my business here, that's all." Sophie looked between them, her fork hovering in the air. Mark forced himself to take another bite, but the food was tasteless. That evening, Rachel left to meet a friend from high school. Mark stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the road. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, but all he felt was the weight of the cooling air settling over the yard. He thought of the photo, the unanswered calls, the quiet way she'd slipped into a new life. And he realized that even though she was back in Texas, the real Rachel, the one who had been his wife, was still hundreds of miles away.
Rachel's time in Cedar Falls passed like a shadow,
present, but never touching anything for long. She stayed 3 nights, each one ending later than the last. Sophie tried to hold on to her mother's attention, showing drawings from school, asking if she could visit Seattle one day. Rachel would smile and say, "We'll see, sweetheart." But her eyes always seemed to drift somewhere else. On the morning she was set to leave, the air was damp with the smell of rain on concrete. Mark stood in the driveway, watching as she loaded her suitcase into the back of a rideshare car. "I'll call," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You don't have to promise something you won't do," Mark replied, his voice steady but low. For a moment, her jaw tightened. Then she leaned down to hug Sophie, quick, like she was afraid of missing her ride. "Be good for your dad," she whispered. The door shut with a hollow click. The car rolled away, tires hissing on wet pavement, and in seconds, she was gone from view. Inside the house, Sophie sat on the couch, staring at the door, as if it might open again. "Is Mom coming back soon?" she asked. Mark crouched down to meet her eyes. He wanted to tell her the truth, that their family would never be the same. But instead, he said, "We'll be okay." It wasn't an answer, but it was all he had. That night, Mark sat on the porch, the air cooling around him. The yard was quiet, except for the steady hum of cicadas. He thought about the years they'd built together, the nights they'd stayed up late talking about dreams that now seemed naive. He realized the ache in his chest wasn't from the betrayal anymore. It was from accepting that love, no matter how deep, can be worn down until there's nothing left to hold.
2 weeks after Rachel left, the rhythms of the house began to change. Mark started waking up earlier, brewing coffee before the sun came up. Sophie sat at the kitchen table each morning with her cereal, hair still messy from sleep, and they talked about small things, school projects, the neighbor's new puppy, the weather. There were still moments when the silence in the house felt too wide, when Mark would glance at the empty chair across the table and remember how Rachel used to sit there, tapping her coffee mug while reading the news on her phone. But those moments didn't cut as deep as before. They were more like a bruise fading under the skin. One Saturday, Mark took Sophie to the park. She ran ahead to the swings, her laughter carrying on the spring breeze. He sat on a bench, watching her pump her legs higher, the sunlight catching in her hair. For the first time in months, he felt something loosen in his chest, a small, tentative sense of peace. In Seattle, Rachel stood at the window of Daniel's apartment, looking out over the city lights. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, resting her head against his chest. From this height, the streets below looked like a map, all lines and intersections leading somewhere. She wondered, just for a moment, what Mark and Sophie were doing that evening. The thought passed quickly, like a bird flying across her view, gone before she could name it. Daniel kissed her hair. "Come back to bed." She turned, leaving the window, the city fading behind her. Back in Cedar Falls, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Mark lit the porch light, listening to Sophie chatter about her day. The ache was still there, but it no longer owned him. Life had shifted, and so had he. The night air was cool, clean. Somewhere inside, he knew the story wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what they could still build from what remained. And in that quiet, under the first stars of the evening, the house felt a little less empty.
It was late summer in Cedar Falls, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke. Mark stood at the edge of the Little League field watching Sophie at bat. She swung hard, sending the ball skimming across the dirt, and ran like she was chasing the wind. A couple of other parents clapped. Mark smiled, a quiet pride settling in his chest. There were still bills to pay, still long shifts at the hardware store, but there was also this, a daughter growing more confident every day, a home that, while quieter, was steadier now. In Seattle, Rachel scrolled through her phone while Daniel cooked dinner in the kitchen. A photo popped up in her feed. Sophie in a baseball jersey, bat slung over her shoulder, grinning wide. Mark must have posted it. For a moment, Rachel's breath caught. She zoomed in, tracing the outline of her daughter's smile. Daniel called her name from the kitchen, breaking the spell. She locked the phone and set it aside. "Coming," she said, and crossed the room. That night in Cedar Falls, after Sophie went to bed, Mark sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The cicadas buzzed in the dark, steady and unbothered. He thought about the years ahead, not in terms of who was gone, but in terms of what was possible. The marriage had ended in silence and distance, but not everything had been taken. Sophie's laughter still filled the rooms, the porch light still glowed warm at night. Some things, he realized, were worth keeping lit.
Betrayal doesn't always arrive with slammed doors and shouting matches. Sometimes it's in the quiet, when someone you love simply stops coming home in their heart. Mark and Rachel's story has ended, but the questions remain. Would you forgive or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more gripping, true-to-life stories of love gone wrong, hit subscribe to Betrayal Diaries, because behind every smile, there might be a secret.